One of the areas of programming that some students struggle a little bit when they first get into it is functions. So I added a couple web pages here on functions. Now functions are really important, and you already realize that we've been using them all along, right? So SpotPy is filled with all these functions that you've been calling. Python has all these built-in functions, and then there's also libraries filled with functions. And now it's time for you to create your own functions. Now the reason we use functions is because, think about if you were going to write a program that was going to have a bunch of date conversions, like we've talked about date conversions. And you can put those into a loop if you're processing one file, but let's say you do that on one project and you go to another project and you want to do the same thing, or another place in your code you want to do a date conversion. You don't want to put the same code over and over again in your programs, because then if something happens with that code, if you want to extend it or make it more interesting, more complex, support more types of dates, you'd have to do that everywhere in your code. So functions allow us to encapsulate, that's a software development term, encapsulate code into a function, okay? And then we can reuse that anywhere in our code. So here on this page, I've got a little bit of sample code for one of the things that we do a fair bit, just concatenating strings. And this is just an example to get you used to the parameters and how parameters work in Python. So again, we do def, function name, parentheses. Parentheses is one of the main things that shows you that you've got a function. Now they're also used for tuples in Python, which are just a static array or list. But other than that, the parentheses, you scream out, this is a function, right? So if there's a name and then parentheses, there's a function. Inside the parentheses are going to be parameters. And the def defines it. That has to come before you call it. Excuse me. And I'll just go ahead and save this. Okay. Now, the thing to remember is that as we do this, we go hello world, and we go into the function. When we go into the function, there's two parameters that are created. In other words, if we take a look at stack data, at this point, we don't have any variables in the stack. There's these things that have underscores on them, but just ignore those. Those are just part of the Python system. Okay, but notice we don't have any parameters yet. When we go into the function, suddenly there's two parameters that are created, first, second parameter, and they've got hello world in them, okay? And so what happened is this value was passed into the function. The function created first parameter and set it equal to hello. Then this second parameter was then passed in. The function created a variable called second parameter and put world into it. Okay, and the way that I'm saying this is really important because this is actually how the computer works. So here the result is equal to first parameter plus second parameter. It's really going into first parameter, taking the contents out of it, hello, concatenating that with world, and putting the result of that concatenation into the result. Here you can see it. Now when we do return, that's going to then take and return this result. Okay, when we leave the function, which takes 2 clicks, notice that first and second parameter have disappeared. Those two parameters only exist within the function. They're created when we go into it, and they're destroyed when we leave. The result is also created in the function, okay? And we say we're going to pass back the result, but what we're really doing is we're passing back the contents of result. Result doesn't survive either. It dies inside the function. But the value that was in result is passed back from concatenate strings, and then the equals tells Python to set it equal to this variable, which it then creates and set the result equal to that. Okay? So we can also do this, so we can change those values. Run it again. You can see there's hello world, and then if we go in, it's going to do the same thing now with a different set of values. It's going to concatenate them together, return them back, print out the new value. Now this is really handy to have, especially with things like conversions. So here I've created a Celsius to Fahrenheit conversion, the kind of thing that you would not want to do over and over again in your code. You just want to do it once, right? It's got some math in it, so we can just figure out that once, and then we'll have a conversion for it. So, we're going to look for what the value of 0 is in Fahrenheit, right? Sorry, when we convert the value 0 in Celsius to Fahrenheit, we get 32, which is what we expect, the temperature at which water freezes. Then we return that back, and there's our degrees Fahrenheit. And then we can do that again with 100, and see that's 212 in Fahrenheit. So this is a really good example of a type of function that you probably want to write, and then you want to save it. You'll want to keep it around, and you'll build up your own base of functions that do utilities for things you're interested in. And a little bit later in the class, we'll show you how to put those into a file, and so that you can then share them between projects. Okay. One of the things I just did was I stepped into the functions. Normally when you're running your programs, you're just going to run right past the functions, boom, there we go, everything works great. When something goes wrong, you want to be able to put a breakpoint in, hit go, and then step into the function. Notice I'm clicking on the one that's pointing into the block. That's the step into. And then normally you'll click on step over. Okay, that's not going to go into anything, because sometimes you'll end up way down in scary Python code. Okay, that'll just step over. And then there's also step out. Don't use that too much unless you're deep down into some functions and you want to step out quickly. Okay, but you'll use these three quite a bit. Play with them and get used to them. I use especially these two a lot. And then start and stop, as you've seen, I use that all the time. And I'm sure you'll use other things in Wing that I don't. Each of us has their own programming style. Okay, so the other thing with functions is functions are something, like I said, that you're going to write, and then you may not look at it for literally years. So the documentation becomes important. Your functions need to have a header on them. Traditionally, the header will have a description. And then your args or parameters. The documentation standards for Python are not as well established as for some other languages. So I tend to use parameters here, but you can use args for arguments. Please use one of those too. And then just a short description of each of the parameters that's coming into the function. And then if it returns anything, go ahead and say what it returns. And if you're really formal, you could say which errors it raises. In other words, later on, you'll see how to raise errors. If someone specifies something that's wrong, if they give you the word hello when you're asking for degrees Fahrenheit, you might put up an error and say, please specify degrees as a number. Okay? So something else I created for students to try and make this a little more clear is this little animation to show you what happens. Here's our function. Again, our function has to be defined before we can call it. Okay? And I'm just going to kind of show you what happens with global and local variables. So as soon as we step forward, if we say favorite fruit equals blueberries, that's going to create a variable called favorite fruit and put in it the value blueberries. Notice it's text or string because it's got the quotes on it. Then we go to makepy or call makepy function. We're going to pass in the value that's in favorite fruit. Remember, we're not passing the variable, even though we say that. We're passing the contents of the variable. Okay, so that will then jump us into the function, and a number of things happen, right? The value blueberries was passed into the function. The function created a variable called type of fruit, set it equal to blueberries. Okay, then we could have other functions within our makepy function. We could get a crust. Now we have a crust. And then we could pass this type of fruit variable into another function. Okay, and that returns us back a pie. So you can there's lots of flexibility with functions. And of course, you can put while loops and if statements and all kinds of other things inside of your functions. So that's where code can get a little more complicated, but also where you get a lot of flexibility. Then we're going to return our pie back, or really, again, the contents of the variable pie, a blueberry pie. Local variables disappear. And now we have my pie equal to a blueberry pie. and then we can keep going with other pies. Okay, have fun.